So anyway, this is kind of cool because it's about Seattle. And this is really what put Seattle on the map. And I'm kind of curious, a quick poll, how many of you here were born in Seattle? Okay, so keep your hands up. How many of you had parents that were born in Seattle? Either one. That cuts it down. Okay, so here's the tough one. How many of you had one of your 4 grandparents born in Seattle? It's pretty good. Anybody go back to great-grandparents?
Oh, I can't go that far.
That's impressive. Okay, well, and the grandparents or great-grandparents.
And he got himself in the Seattle history book for blowing off his fingers on the 4th of July.
It's always good to remember for something important. Okay. So anyway, we're going to talk about the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, which is 1909. And I'm going to quickly go through a little about the purchase of Alaska, about the discovery of gold. A lot of this is history versus the so-called dollars. And then talk about the exposition and then the so-called dollars that were created out of this. And the only so-called dollar I've got from this is the Utah coin, which you'll see in a bit. But there's 23 varieties, as we'll get to. So anyway, we acquired, this is timely with Trump and Putin on Friday, we acquired Alaska in 1867, and this was a deal that was in the works about 10 years. Our negotiations broke off because of the Civil War. But the two people involved, representing the Tsar Alexander II, was Baron Edward de Stokel. And he was kind of the Tsar's foreign minister for about a 10-year period. On our side of the table was Secretary of State William Seward. Seward began in the Lincoln administration, and after Lincoln's assassination, he stayed on under Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson had absolutely no interest in acquiring Alaska, and he just deferred to the cabinet, and the cabinet deferred to Seward. And Seward is the real reason we ended up acquiring Alaska. He really wanted this to happen. And most historians feel it's because, really for a purpose of self-aggrandizement. He wanted to burnish his own legacy by adding all this real estate, even though at the time it was viewed as pretty much worthless. So he was the driving force behind this. This is a facsimile of the check we paid for Alaska, $7.2 million in gold. And by today's gold standard, that'd be a little under $1 billion. Now, in hindsight, that was a hell of a good deal.
Yeah.
We got gold, we got petroleum, we got strategic placement now. But at the time, this was viewed as a colossal waste of money. And one of the problems was it was discovered a few months after this was consummated that the Tsar had hoped to get as much as $5 million. And Seward ended up paying 7.2 because Seward wanted it to happen so bad. He was just a terrible negotiator. De Stokel just kept increasing the price, and Seward just say, okay, that's it, but it's our final offer. And then he'd say, well, we need more, and so it ended up being 7.2 million. And because it was viewed as not a great purchase or investment, for the next 30 years, it was pretty much ridiculed in the media, by other politicians. You know, this was called Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox. One newspaper I read called it that Seward had bought a sucked orange. It's a hell of a metaphor, isn't it? So it was really viewed as just him buying a wasteland for a lot more money than we really needed to. And of course, that was until gold was discovered. And that really changed everything. This is a picture of one of the gold ships coming into Seattle. And this was a huge boon for Seattle because everything had to get funneled through Seattle. Some may have gone through San Francisco, but the vast bulk of the stampeders went through Seattle. And of course, I think you guys all know, the people who really make money consistently in these things are the merchants who sell equipment to the people who go up and don't know what they're doing. And so this is, you know, when these ships would arrive, the docks were just mobbed with people. These were huge events because, like in this case, you'd have a ship bring in over $100 million in today's value of gold, and people love to see that kind of stuff. The route that most of the gold rush went, as far as the Yukon gold rush, starts in Seattle and go through the inland passage to either Skagway or Dyea. Now you can go to both these places on cruise ships now. From there, you would go overland over the Chilkoot Trail. And this was only about 33 miles, but it was a lot tougher than most people thought. The numbers are that about 100,000 people left for the Klondike Goldfields. And the reason that number, fairly significant is it was close enough to be, obtainable, but still far enough away to be kind of like viewed as kind of a romantic adventure. So about 100,000 people left for the gold rush. Only about 30 to 40,000 actually got there. Of that, they estimate about 4,000 people found gold, and only a couple hundred actually, struck it rich, so to speak. So after Chilkoot Pass, you would go down the Yukon River 500 miles to Dawson City, to the gold rush area, to stake your claim and hopefully find gold. But as I mentioned, the Chilkoot Trail was a lot tougher than most people thought. It really wasn't conducive to pack animals, and so most of the gear had to be carried manually. And unlike this picture, was either spring or summer, probably 8 or 9 months of the year, it's below freezing with snow and whatnot. So it was really hard going, and that's why so few people, stampeders, actually got there. This is probably the most iconic picture of the Klondike Gold Rush, and certainly of the Chilkoot Pass. This is the Chilkoot Pass, and it's nicknamed the Golden Stairs. And the stampeders would aggregate down here and carry loads up the pass to get into the Yukon. Now, the reason this was particularly tough, and I've actually been this, I've hiked this in the summer, and it's only about 1,000 feet from the point down here at the bottom to the top. But the problem was that the top of the pass was the boundary between the Yukon, Canada, and Alaska. And there were mounted police at the top who wouldn't let you in to the Yukon unless you had a year's supply of food with you. So this is before dehydrated food, before instant food. So a year's supply of food weighed about 1,200 pounds. And then you're bringing in all your gear, your tools, your equipment. So the average stampeder was bringing about 2,000 pounds of gear with them. And you had to lug it up over the pass. And, if you do the math, if you can carry maybe 100 pounds or something, and this historian says that at the height of the rush, a round trip might take you 6 hours. That's a lot of days in just lugging this stuff up and over the Chilkoot Pass to meet the requirement that the mounted police were providing. And, if you got out of this line, they might not let you back in for an hour or something. I mean, it was really competitive. Everybody wanted to get there as fast as possible. One of the things I didn't mention is that, when this occurred in Seattle, when the news got out in Seattle, the mayor quit, half the police force, all the trolley drivers, this huge group of the city quit their jobs and went up to the Yukon because everybody knew, first come, first serve, whoever gets there first is going to have the best chance to get gold. So it really hollowed out a lot of the businesses and the workers in the Seattle area. So I thought this, those of you who do a lot of hiking or have done a lot of hiking, not a lot of Gore-Tex in this picture. This shows how, the equipment and the gear they had is pretty tough. You're just talking about layers and layers of wool clothing. Some of those mittens are pretty interesting. So it was, hard going, and obviously a lot of times it was far below freezing. I think this is a pretty good example for those of you who've ever carried a pack. All they're doing is strapping a crate to their back, which isn't very comfortable after very long.
Can I throw in a little tip?
Color? Absolutely.
There is a company called Filson who makes great wool clothing, and they date back to this rush and supplying people on the pass.
God, see, they're still getting dividends from all those sales. Okay, so once you got up to the pass, you go a few more miles into Lake Lindeman, and this is the headwaters of the Yukon River. Most of the stampeders would get there when the lake and a lot of the river was still frozen, so they would have to wait it out until the spring thaw. But that gave them time to build a makeshift boat or a raft to carry all their gear down the river. And as you would expect, or as some of the old movies have portrayed, there were a lot of rapids along the way, and a lot of people lost their gear, a lot of lives were lost in the rapids. Eventually the Mounties wouldn't let women, because the women did eventually go up here, wouldn't let women go down the rapids. They had to walk around because they thought it was too dangerous for women. Anyway, and then you get to Dawson City, and one of the things that isn't usually mentioned in the traditional boomtown stuff is that here's an example of what was an outpost or a village with 500 people in 1896. Okay, the year the gold was actually discovered. 2 years later, there's 17,000 people there. Okay, not a lot of real good sewage facilities. You had a lot of epidemics. You had a lot of just really unsanitary conditions, a lot of fires, just because there were so many people and obviously absolutely no infrastructure. My favorite part of this, down at the bottom there, is anything important that had to be carried up is going to be real expensive. And nails, kind of handy if you're going to build anything, were the equivalent of $800 a pound for nails in today's dollars. That's more than Home Depot, Ray, when I go there to buy nails. So we're going to fast forward a few years to get to the exposition, to 1905. And in 1905, the City Fathers of Seattle thought, it would be great to have kind of a commemorative event around the gold rush, because it was such a huge boom for Seattle business. And in the original planning, they expanded the scope of it. Originally, it was going to be fairly small. I said, well, let's expand this to the whole Pacific Rim. Let's make this like a World's Fair and really do a big deal. So they were hoping to have it in 1907, because that was the 10-year anniversary when gold first came out. But there was a problem. Virginia had already kind of circled 1907 on the calendar for the Jamestown tercentennial. So 1907 was out. Oh, what about 1908? Presidential election year. So they kind of kiboshed that. So 1909 is what they decided on. And actually that turned out to be a good thing. It gave them more time to fundraise. The total exposition cost about $10 million from federal, state, local philanthropy, everything else. And about a little over 3.5 million people passed through the turnstile from June 1st to middle of October 1909. And that's, I think it's like 7 or 8 times the population of the state of Washington. So a lot, which is typical of the expositions, where you'd have way more people attend in these days than the populations of the state they were held in. As far as the location, and somebody, maybe Roland, you had asked about this, but there wasn't really any good place. You're familiar with Seattle and all the hills. Where are you going to have this? Well, the University of Washington had a bunch of real estate they weren't using and wasn't developed. So on a 250-acre spot up around the University of Washington, they held the exposition. So now I'm going to give you a tidbit, which makes for a really bad pun. So this was the first dry World's Fair. Yeah, it's a bad pun because it rains in Seattle. Okay. Anyway, so it was on University of Washington. Nobody liked that. It was on University of Washington property, and at the time it was against the law to consume, sell, whatever, liquor on the grounds of the University of Washington. So again, first World's Fair where no liquor was supposed to be sold or consumed. Supposed to be. So on the grounds, they constructed about 80 buildings. Most of these were very temporary, framing with plaster of Paris, intended to be torn down in a few months. But about 8 or 9 were pretty permanent. And a lot of the states had buildings. A lot of trade associations or groups, as you can see, had buildings. Government had a building. And again, some of the counties in Washington State had buildings. And within those, there were about 800 exhibitors, exposition-wide, about 800 exhibitors. Now, getting to numismatics finally. Any of these expositions always create medals to award to the exhibitors, to the better exhibitors. And this is the one that was designed for the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, We've got the woman figure representing Seattle. She's holding an olive branch. Under her left hand is a bust of Washington. It looks a little creepy, like it's his head. And then to the right, or our right, you got a miner and a lumberjack representing the natural resources of the area, and Native American underneath in a canoe. And then this would the exhibitor who won this particular award would have their name inscribed on the reverse of it. And these are actually fairly common. You can get them on eBay for very, very reasonable. One of the reasons is, I mentioned there were 800 exhibitors or thereabouts. And if you do the math on how many medals they created, pretty much every exhibitor won a medal. It's kind of the participation ribbon today. So they made sure that everybody got an award of some kind, and that's why they're relatively common today. Well, anyway, this again, big deal in Seattle. First day, there were about 91,000 people who attended. And the way they opened it is that they had President Taft sitting in Washington, D.C. with his finger poised over a telegraph key, and then he would send the message, and then when it was received in Seattle, they would cut the ribbon. And so that's how they launched the thing. The logo, which was designed by a local woman, Adele Hanscom, and this is important because this is the logo they carried on all the so-called dollars. But the woman on the far left in purple is representing Asia. She's Japanese, holding a steamer ship. The woman in white in the middle, holding gold, is obviously representing the Yukon or Alaska. And then the woman on the right in green represents the Pacific slope or the Pacific coast, holding a locomotive. And I know you can't see too well, the colored rays over their heads are the Northern Lights, yeah. And how these are treated created some of the varieties of the so-called dollars. There's 23 different varieties of these official so-called dollars. This is one. This is, again, one of the official ones. And these were actually engraved by George Morgan of the Morgan dollar. And you've got the logo there with the women. And in this instance, they have a picture of William Seward. And during this, William Seward kind of got the recognition that he was overdue. For whatever reason, he did have the foresight to make this happen, which turned out to be a pretty good real estate deal. On the reverse of this variety, and there's a lot of mixing and matching, you've got the seal of Seattle. And this is intended to be Chief Seal. Now, the reality is, Roland, you probably read this, Seattle didn't have a seal at this time. They didn't have an official seal until 1939. George Morgan invented this and just kind of used it. So it's sort of an unofficial seal of Seattle. So I mentioned how the Northern Lights are treated differently created a lot of the varieties. And you've got treatment like in the original logo that are very symmetrical. You've got asymmetrical that are coming out of the central figure's head, different number of rays. And then another thing that created varieties is on the reverse, they might feature the manufacturer's building or the government building. These were kind of the two anchor buildings of the exposition. This shows one of the varieties. We don't see Seward on this variety. And I have to tell you, I don't know why they came up with this many varieties. If it was, I don't know what the reason is for that. Some of you may know. But this variety has the manufacturer's building on the reverse instead of that Seattle seal. And I have to tell you, when I was doing the research, some of these major buildings were really big. This is the manufacturer's building. Here's that same building under construction. I mean, you got two women standing. It's a pretty big building. And these are the ones that they would retain and not tear down. And in Shevlin and Hyder's book, it references how the reason that some of these were permanent buildings and others were just like framing and plaster of Paris, if they had anything of an artistic element in them that needed to be insured, the insurers required it be a traditional structure, not something that's going to be torn down. And that was the difference in a lot of these buildings of why some were more permanent and others were, temporary. So Taft did visit the exposition on September 30th. Big deal. Of course, we had a lot of the, perfunctory speeches and the VIPs. One of the things he did that was real popular with the general people attending is the Alaska building, you could pan for gold. And so Taft rolled up his sleeves and he panned for gold, and the crowd, loved that kind of thing. The other thing in the Alaska building, which I thought was kind of clever, they had a display with 70 gold bars and a lot of nuggets with a value in those days of $1.25 million. Today's gold value, just a hair under $300 million. And again, people love to look at that kind of stuff. But the security features on this I thought were kind of slick. So they had, bulletproof glass, of course, and they have guards around the clock. But after the exposition closed, at night, the whole display descended into the subterranean vault. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie National Treasure with Nicolas Cage, where there's a map on the back of the Declaration. Anybody see that? Yeah. Okay. So it's like that. So, this whole thing descends. But, for 1909, that's pretty slick. Anyway, I thought so. So the medal they made, or the so-called dollar, to specifically commemorate Taft's visit, is considered the most artistic of all of them. You've got the three women, they're in different positions. The central figure, which is Alaska or the Yukon, is holding nuggets but standing up. And then they, the motto or the logo is mentioning Taft's visit on September 30th, 1909. And a lot of these medals are either gold-plated brass, silver-plated brass, copper, or bronze. One of the things on this medal, and you'll see on some of the others, and I blew this up, but it's not very clear. Right here, that out of focus smudging says the Mayer Brothers. The Mayer Brothers was a jewelry firm in Seattle that had won the concession to sell and market all these so-called dollars, even the ones, minted by the government. And so their name appears on a lot of these so-called dollars. So the government building is probably what all of us would have thought was the most interesting. Interesting from an educational standpoint, Ray, because of what was inside of it. They had a post office department with a complete stamp collection. They had a U.S. Treasury department with banknotes and bonds, a Bureau of Engraving and Printing that was demonstration. They even had an assay office. In 1909, people were still bringing gold out of Alaska, and so you could actually bring in your ore and have it assayed and have it refined right there on the spot, which is kind of cool. And then the mint had a large portion of the government building where they were actually minting the so-called dollars. They brought coining presses out, and so you could actually get your so-called dollars literally hot off the press. This is a variety that highlights the government building. And there on the obverse, in this instance, we've got the kind of unofficial seal of Seattle. And there's even a couple varieties where they have different numbers of flags here. Again, I don't know why those differences occurred, but again, 23 totally different varieties. Okay, this is a quick diversion. The most popular part of this exposition was the pay streak. The pay streak is where you had restaurants, rides, kind of that circus sideshow stuff. And the most popular part of, and the pay streak, you guys probably all know this, but the pay streak is the name of the vein of gold or silver that runs through rock or ore. It's called the pay streak. And that's what the nickname was. So the most popular part of the pay streak was an exhibit called The Streets of Cairo. And this was also the most controversial, kind of as Dan explained with Miss Standing Liberty, is that they had a dancer in the streets of Cairo who was named Princess Lola. And Princess Lola was somewhat scantily clad for 1909, and she performed what they called the Death Dance of Cleopatra. And you can go back to the old PIs. A lot of the churches in the area, a lot of the kind of the moralist groups were outraged. They called her licentious, and she was probably wearing the equivalent of a one-piece bathing suit or 1909. But anyway, it was very popular, very, very controversial at the time. But Seward got his due recognition during the course of this. The U.S. Postal Service issued this on June 1st, 1909, first day of issue, coordinated with the opening of the exposition. And I was embarrassed to say this is the only so-called dollar that I own from this. But the state of Utah had a building, and they also produced their own so-called dollar. And these were promoting Utah's copper industry. And these were done in both silver and copper. They tend to tone pretty nicely. All the ones I've seen of these particular so-called dollars are nicely toned. But and you probably notice I've got the Shevlin-Heider numbers on all these for those of you who are really, really into these. Just a couple more. This is one that's called the gold panner. So-called dollar, much different look, but you've got a gold panner in the middle. On the upper left of the obverse, we have Chief Sealth. And on the upper right, we've got William Seward, and it says the father of Alaska. And then on the reverse, again, probably can't read it, but here it says the progressive mayors. And that's not city mayors, that's the Mayor brothers promoting themselves again on the coinage that they were able to sell. And then this one that obviously highlights William Seward with him on the obverse. And this one happened to highlight the two kind of leading citizens that really came up with the idea, led the committee, really coordinated all the logistics and everything involved in a major exposition. Like this guy Chilberg, he was the president of the committee, and again one of the founding fathers, if you will, that came up with the whole idea. And then stamped here, kind of after the fact, and it says Mayor Brothers, Seattle, Washington. So I'm going to conclude with what I think is the most interesting. This is actually why Roland came, right? The most interesting part of this as far as the coinage, and that is the, quote, official gold coins of the exposition. And I put official in quotes. There were three versions of this: a 1 pennyweight, half pennyweight, and quarter pennyweight. And just as a reminder, a pennyweight is about 1/20th of an ounce. And these were 10 carats. So they were all small, not a lot of gold in these things. But it's the two guys behind this that are interesting. The designer of this is a guy named Jules Charbonneau. He ran Ye Olde Curiosity Shop, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. He actually was a sailor. I got this from Bill Hyder, who met his grandson or something. Sailor, met Ye Olde Curiosity Shop's daughter. A week later, they were married. That's fast. And they ended up running the place for quite a few years. But he designed these. But the guy who marketed them, are you guys familiar with Farron Zerbe? Yes. Some are nodding. Farron Zerbe was, I believe, in the San Francisco area, but he was very prominent numismatist that you would say had aggressive marketing tactics. If he was today, he'd probably be doing infomercials, promising huge returns. The ANA had a major award named after him. They kind of revisited that and changed that because he's not viewed quite as positively now as he used to be. That was kind of controversial. But essentially, you have these two guys that are like the P.T. Barnums of the West Coast promoting these, quote, official gold dollars. And Charbonneau actually made dollars for some of the expositions later in the years, too. But just interesting provenance or pedigree, I guess. And so that's it. And if you guys have any questions, I can't promise I can answer them, but Roland's got a book here, so I'm sure